Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Solana and what some of our indicators are making of its recent price action. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter, where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So for Solana, I want to start our conversation here with our risk indicator, the upside downside potential indicator. If you've been following the channel, you're incredibly familiar with this model at this point. Essentially, high scores mean high risk when the upside potential is low, downside potential is high. -5 is the opposite. When downside potential is low, upside potential is quite high. And you can see that over time, the UDPI has done a good job of quantifying risk, flashing green at these good accumulation zones and then red at these distribution zones. Showing you here the long-term version of the UDPI. This cares about moves that play out over months, a bit longer in its time preference. And what you can see is, we had gone up into this massive run out of the summer, and we had actually then rolled back down into this value zone, this green zone, all the way kind of through here as we formed this kind of potential local bottom, as then we rallied out of that more recently. And you see the UDPI has then adjusted more upwards, but still in the green zone, right? It's still down in here. We never, even in this pump here, we didn't really get to anything especially concerning from the long-term UDPI's perspective, suggesting that if the market wants to pump right now, or if rallies are in the offing, then Solana could have considerable room to move to the upside. So that's what I'm seeing here. So we've realized some of this upside potential going into here, but there's still quite a bit that remains. And we can see this if we just look at the UDPI level across time. So that's what this is, just plotting UDPI level across time here. And so you can see coming out of the summer, we had that huge rally, that kind of blockbuster rally that Solana had put in. And then we came down and corrected relatively deeply, moving down all the way to just above -4 here. And that was suggesting that at this point in time for Solana, based on everything the model knows about Solana, this was, in its estimation, quite low risk. That upside potential from here was very reasonable, very, in some ways, expected. And that's what ended up indeed happening. And now where we stand now, I think what we sit in a point where, again, as I was mentioning before, should the market decide to rally from here, then I think we could realize quite a bit of upside potential. Solana is sitting in a pretty reasonable spot. But, should the market decide to dump again, correcting back down to these levels or even breaking back down below could end up happening. And so really, I think when you're reading these kind of risk levels, especially for altcoins, you have to always do it in the context of the broader market. Do you think the broader market is in a more bullish or bearish state? I think it's in a more bullish state, and that overall the market's going to be trending up, then these kind of levels look very favorable. But if you're more thinking that we're going into a bear market and the broader the broader crypto markets are going into a bear market, then this would not necessarily be all that that appetizing, because again, you'd expect us to go back down to these lower levels in a bear market. And so this would not necessarily be as favorable of an entry as it could be if you think the market's going bullish. And so that's why these are always contextual, right? That, if you think that the upside is more likely, there's quite a bit of room to the upside, and that's a pretty good risk reward ratio the model thinks that is an offer if we should rally from here. But you always want to keep in mind the downside risks inherent in crypto, especially in market conditions like right now, where it's not really clear if we're ready to go on a bull run, anything like that. In fact, a lot of people are arguing a bear market's around the corner. I think that's where you have to form your own thesis and then interpret the data accordingly. So we can also look at some of our other indicators that we track. So we also have the medium-term UDPI, which cares about moves that play out over weeks to months, so a bit shorter in its time preference from the long term, as well as the short-term UDPI, which is reactive to moves that play out over days to weeks, so even shorter. And you can see kind of confluence across all of these, that they're all sitting at a relatively similar level. And so the way that I see this is that, should we see a impulsive move to the upside across the crypto markets, I think that Solana is very well positioned to have a nice move back to the upside if that were to happen, sitting down in the negatives on the short term, negative 1.63. This is a bit lower than a lot of the other assets that we're watching in the short term, which might suggest that Solana could have some decent room to move up should the market decide to get bullish. And then likewise in the medium term, we're still sitting in the negatives, where again, it would be plausible in the coming weeks for us to realize some of that upside. Really, once we start getting up into these higher values is when I'd start to get really concerned in the more shorter term that any kind of short-term move to the upside might be running out of steam. We're not really quite at that level just yet. So the final indicator I want to talk about here before just switching over to the Solana price chart is the trend confidence indicator for Sol USD. So this is not a risk indicator. If you've been watching the channel, you're familiar with the TCI now as well. Essentially, this is just telling us how confident we should be in a given trend that the asset is in. So for example, if Solana is in an uptrend and the TCI is green, if it's above 0, that suggests that we can be confident in that trend, that that is a reliable trend that we might want to think will continue. But then when it crashes below 0, that's when you might think that that local uptrend is over. So for example, this big move up into the spring of 21, it flipped green right at the genesis of that and stayed green all the way up until right here when that move was starting to peter out, flipped green, or excuse me, flipped red. And then when you're in an uptrend and the TCI is red, that suggests that you have to be a little bit cautious of that uptrend, that it's not super likely for it to continue all that long. So even though we did rally a bit further from here, TCI did flip for a green for a bit. It wasn't as convinced by this move as it was by this move. And indeed, the multiples you would have realized on this move were far larger than the multiples realized in this move. And then you can see it flipped red, and then we went into this correction going into the summer all the way down to here, red. But then again, at the genesis of this move, flipped green again all the way up, and then flipped red. And so even though we actually technically put in a higher high here than here, the TCI was bearish this whole time, suggesting that it didn't think that this move was all that convincing to the upside. And indeed, that then preceded this massive direction to the downside that we've been in. So this was acting as a leading indicator. And that's what the TCI often is able to do. It acted as a leading indicator here, a leading indicator here, and a leading indicator here that, upside, downside was likely. And that indeed happened. I mean, you can see is that it did it again just recently, right? We had this prolonged downtrend. Around here, the TCI started to kind of get less and less convinced in this downtrend, kind of waffling around 0. And then you see it actually popped up above 0 here. Even though we were still in a technical downtrend, it had popped up into the green, and then indeed we popped off from there. Had this, I think it was about a 2x rally from here to here, right around when the TCI flipped, had been holding a bullish outlook on Solana. And now it's still holding a green, it's still holding in the green, suggesting that it still thinks that this looks more like an uptrend than a downtrend. And so I think it would be possible for us to move up from here. And so if the broader market allows it, I think the fact that we're seeing a pretty low short-term UDPI reading and we're seeing the TCI being bullish on Solana could be a nice combination that could set it up for some more upside, should, again, broader market allow for it. If Bitcoin doesn't capitulate or something like that, I think that Solana could do quite well. So none of this is financial advice, of course, but that's just kind of what these indicators are pointing to, that it seems like Solana might be in a position where upside potential is quite plausible from here, again, should broader market conditions allow. So if upside is plausible, let's look at some levels we might be wanting to watch for where we might expect it to start, kind of petering out if it were to move to the upside. And I think one way that we can kind of visualize some of these levels just by looking at where volume has transacted within this kind of more recent range for Solana. So ever since kind of the fall, September, all the way to the present day, where has most of the volume transpired for Solana? And what you can see is that the vast majority of volume transacted at these levels all the way up here, right? And you can actually see that as Solana rallied out in mid-March, rallied all the way up here to around $142, $43 in this range here, we kind of went up and then kind of bumped our heads on this region where we started to see a lot of that volume existing from the past, right? A lot of volume from here and over here transpired in this range here. Could be some people who are still holding on to bags from these higher levels who decided to exit as Solana got back up to their cost basis. And so I would see a rally back up to this level as being quite plausible, but then I think Solana is going to have to do more and more work to keep on pushing above this level, especially to get back towards the all-time high, because look at all this volume that's transacted. Now, of course, a lot of these coins that were, or excuse me, a lot of the SOL that was bought here likely could have been sold down here, and so not all of this represents current cost bases of investors, but there still is a decent chance there are a number of bag holders who still are hanging out at these higher levels. And so as price would go up to their cost bases, they might be tempted to sell while they can, especially if they don't believe Solana is going to be able to go in and put up all-time highs. And with given how bearish the more macro picture is, I think that's quite plausible. So if we do see continued upside, like the TCI, is thinking is plausible, and like the short-term UDPI is thinking is plausible, I think we could certainly rally back up to these levels, but then I'd start watching it and becoming more and more pessimistic unless broader sentiment really changes for us to be able to slice through all of this volume that was up here. So obviously there's no guarantees. You know, crypto can do anything, Solana can do anything. We could just go crazy, and that's assuming we move to the upside. You know, also moving back to the downside, having a TCI flip red, etc. More of that downside could happen as well. But it certainly seems plausible to me we could go back and retest these levels if this kind of current resumption of some upside, at least across the market in the more recent days, if that continues. So just to kind of wrap us up then, I also just want to talk a little bit about where Solana sits in terms of value locked on DeFi. So I'm on DeFi Llama right now, and this is just showing total value locked on DeFi across different chains. And obviously Ethereum's the big one. Solana's sitting down here at number 5, which actually Solana's been able to regain some ground. You know, Phantom had flipped it for a while. Solana has pushed back to the upside. And this is something that you want to see, right? Because one of the things that has been giving a lot of value to some of these layer 1 blockchains is value locked on DeFi. Kind of the use case or the usage of these networks for things like DeFi seems to be something that has attracted a lot of valuation to those different blockchains. So the fact that Solana's been able to hold its ground recently is good news for it. You know, if Solana had really been dropping down through the rankings, that would become kind of increasingly concerning in a lot of ways from a more fundamental perspective. Essentially, that just means that there's still going to be a good amount of Solana demand just in terms of, you know, using the network, literally just having to have Solana to use Solana. And then also, the more that you use the chain, the more that people might just be taking profits into Solana, all that kind of thing that can be help to appreciate the price. So just another thing that I always keep an eye on is how are these, especially these layer 1 blockchains, how are they doing in terms of things like value locked on DeFi? And, you know, Solana is currently sitting here on CoinMarketCap at number 7 in terms of its market cap. But this is, if you remember back, you know, in the fall, this is still way down from the market cap Solana was at before. And so if bullish sentiment returns, you know, being on a market cap of 35 billion is not something that's unheard of for Solana. You know, it's been quite a bit higher in the past. So my overall outlook is that I think should we kind of continue to see these rallies across the market, I think that from a risk perspective and from the TCI's perspective, some upside movement from Solana would be very plausible. I would just be watching these levels here. Once we get up to around the 140, kind of as we get up to these levels again, that's where I would think Solana is going to have to do more and more work to move back to the upside. So none of this is financial advice. You should form your own opinions of what you think is going to happen with Solana. Those are just some things that I'm looking at right now.